There are friendships the world sees, and then there are friendships the world never truly understands. For over 2 decades, Elton John carried something with him. A memory, a grief, a story that belonged to him alone. He smiled through interviews, performed for billions, and built a life filled with music, family, and purpose. But in the quiet corners of his heart, there was always something unfinished. A chapter he hadn't fully opened. A name he couldn't say without feeling the weight of everything that was lost. Princess Diana, the woman who made him laugh harder than anyone else on earth. The woman he nearly lost as a friend long before the world lost her forever. And now, after years of silence, Elton John is finally telling the truth about what their friendship really looked like, what broke it apart, and what he wishes he had said before it was too late. The story begins long before the world knew Diana's face, long before the wedding dresses and magazine covers, and the fairy tale that millions believed in. It begins in the early 1980s, when a young woman named Diana Spencer was still learning who she was, still figuring out what her life was going to become. Elton John, by contrast, had already become a legend. He had sold out arenas across the world, dressed in the most outrageous costumes imaginable, and sat at the piano with a kind of effortless brilliance that made grown men weep. He had dined with dukes and performed for queens. He had been invited to royal gatherings and aristocratic dinners where he often sat feeling more like a curiosity than a guest. Despite the fame, despite the glamour, Elton never quite felt like he belonged in those gilded rooms. And then he met her. It was a birthday celebration for Prince Andrew, held inside Windsor Castle, the kind of evening that most people could only dream about. The rooms were lit up with chandeliers, the air was thick with formality, and Elton was doing what he always did in those situations, retreating to the piano and playing softly while the world moved around him. He was performing, yes, but more than that, he was hiding in plain sight. And then a young woman walked into the room, and the entire atmosphere shifted. She wasn't yet a princess. She hadn't yet carried the weight of the crown on her shoulders. But she walked in with a kind of warmth that cut right through the stiffness of the evening. Elton looked up from the piano and saw her, and something changed. Not in a romantic sense, but in the way that sometimes happens between two people who recognize something in each other without exchanging a single word. Within moments of being introduced, they were talking like old friends, not the polished, careful conversation of royal gatherings, but real conversation, full of humor and teasing and a kind of freedom that neither of them experienced very often in those circles. They ended up dancing together, doing something as ridiculous and joyful as a Charleston in the middle of Windsor Castle, surrounded by lords and ladies who didn't quite know what to make of it. Elton would later say that he felt, in that moment, as though he had always known her, as though she was someone his life had simply been waiting to introduce him to. And Diana, for her part, seemed to feel exactly the same. She had a way of making every person she spoke to feel as though they were the most important person in the room. But with Elton, it was different. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was just herself. What people rarely understood about Diana was how lonely she truly was. The fairy tale that the world celebrated was, behind closed doors, something far more complicated. She was walking into a marriage that would demand everything from her, while offering very little in return. She was entering a family defined by duty and distance, where emotion was treated as weakness and vulnerability was something to be hidden rather than honored. Elton understood that loneliness at a cellular level, because despite being one of the most famous and celebrated musicians on the planet, he too had spent years feeling profoundly unseen. Behind the sequins and the oversized glasses and the sold-out concerts was a man who had battled addiction, heartbreak, and the constant exhausting pressure of living a public life, while keeping so much of his true self hidden. They saw each other. That was the foundation of everything. Through the 1980s, their friendship grew in ways that the public glimpsed but never fully understood. They appeared together at charity events, at galas, at dinners, always laughing, always at ease with one another. But the real friendship happened away from the cameras. It happened in private phone calls and quiet visits where no one was performing for anyone. Diana would talk to him about the impossible weight of royal life, about the suffocating loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. And Elton would share his own struggles, the self-destruction he was doing his best to manage, the identity he was still trying to claim in a world that had very specific ideas about who he was supposed to be. They gave each other something rare in both their worlds, the freedom to simply be human. One of the things that bonded them most deeply was their shared commitment to people who'd been abandoned by the rest of the world. When the AIDS crisis was devastating communities and politicians were looking away and the public was gripped by fear and misinformation, Diana walked into hospital wards and sat beside patients who had been told they were untouchable. She held their hands. She embraced them. She looked them in the eye with genuine compassion at a time when the stigma surrounding AIDS was so overwhelming that most public figures wouldn't go anywhere near it. For Elton, who had lost so many friends to the disease and who had dedicated enormous energy to fighting it, watching Diana do that was one of the most profound things he ever witnessed. She wasn't performing kindness. She was living it, and it changed him. She made him braver. That was the thing Elton has returned to again and again when speaking about what Diana meant to him. She made him believe that compassion was not a weakness, that it was in fact the most powerful thing a person could bring to the world. In the middle of the AIDS crisis, when Elton was channeling his grief into advocacy, Diana was beside him not just in spirit, but in action. Together, they represented something the public desperately needed, proof that love and dignity could exist even in the darkest corners of a crisis. The work they did, separately and alongside one another, saved lives, real lives, and that mattered to both of them in a way that no amount of fame or applause ever could. But friendship between two people living under that level of scrutiny was never going to be simple. There were pressures on Diana that Elton could see, but couldn't always reach her through. The palace had its own ideas about who she should be associated with, and what causes were appropriate, and what image she should project. And as the 1990s arrived and Diana's marriage crumbled publicly and painfully, those pressures only intensified. She was navigating a divorce that wasn't just the end of a marriage, but the unraveling of an identity that had been built for her by an institution that was now discarding her. The press followed her constantly. The palace offered no protection. And within that chaos, even the most solid relationships began to show cracks. The rift between them, when it came, was rooted in something that might seem small from the outside. Elton was putting together a charity book connected to AIDS awareness, a project he cared about deeply, one that he believed would raise both money and attention for a cause that still desperately needed both. Diana had agreed to contribute, to write something for the project, and her involvement meant everything to him, not just as a publicity advantage, but as a symbol of the friendship and the shared values they had always stood for together. And then, without warning, she pulled out. A letter arrived, cool and formal, citing concerns that had clearly come from somewhere above her. Advisors who didn't like certain images in the book, who worry about the optics of a royal being associated with that kind of material. Elton was crushed, not because plans had changed. He had dealt with canceled plans and last-minute reversals his entire career. What hurt was the silence that followed. He reached out to express his disappointment, and what came back was something sharp and cold, a letter that felt less like Diana and more like the institution she was trying to escape. The warmth was gone. The honesty was gone, and in its place was the kind of formal distance that represented everything they had always privately mocked together about the world they both moved through. Elton said later that he wasn't angry about her decision. He was heartbroken about the wall that suddenly appeared between two people who had promised each other they would always tell the truth. For nearly a year, they didn't speak, and Elton has been honest in a way that reveals genuine regret about what that silence cost. He could have called. He knew that. She could have called. He knew that too. But pride is a powerful and destructive thing, particularly between two people who have both spent their lives being strong in public. Neither of them reached across the distance, and the months passed. Diana was rebuilding her life with extraordinary courage, doing her humanitarian work, becoming something even more powerful than she had been as a working royal. And Elton was carrying on, performing and advocating and doing the work. But both of them were quietly carrying the ache of something left unresolved. It was grief that finally broke the silence. When Gianni Versace was murdered outside his Miami home in the summer of 1997, both Diana and Elton lost someone who had been a true friend to each of them. Versace had been a rare kind of person in their world, generous and genuine and entirely without pretension, and his sudden violent death shook them both to their foundations. At the funeral in Milan, Diana spotted Elton across the room, and without hesitation, without allowing pride or history or awkwardness to get in the way, she walked over to him and took his hand. The words she used, the quiet acknowledgement that what had come between them was not worth the distance it had created, were so simple and so completely Diana. She cut right through everything. And just like that, the friendship was alive again. They made plans. They talked about seeing each other, about picking up where they had left off, about all the things that real friends talk about when they've been apart too long and are finally finding their way back. Elton felt something lift in him that day in Milan, the particular relief that comes from repairing something you thought might be permanently broken. He didn't know, as they embraced at that funeral, that they were also saying goodbye. He didn't know that 6 weeks later, the phone call would come in the middle of the night, that he would turn on the television and see a world that had come to a complete stop. When Diana died in that Paris tunnel on the 31st of August, 1997, Elton John lost something that he has never fully recovered. He has said this in different ways across different years. The grief was not only for a friend, but for the conversation that would never happen, for the laughter that went permanently quiet, for all the plans they'd made at Versace's funeral that would never come to pass. He has spoken about being woken by his fax machine that night, receiving confused condolences before he even knew what happened, and then the devastating clarity of the television screen. She was 36 years old, and everything that was still unfinished between them would stay that way forever. He performed at her funeral because the Spencer family asked him to, and because there was nothing else in the world he could have done that would have meant more. He sat at the piano inside Westminster Abbey and sang a song he had rewritten specifically for her, words that try to hold something that words can't hold, the loss of a person who had been irreplaceable. His hands were trembling. Millions of people were watching, and yet in that moment, Elton was not a performer. He was a man saying goodbye to his friend. The song sold more copies than any single in recorded history. But Elton has never been able to feel good about that. To him, it isn't a record. It is a wound. What Elton John has finally allowed the world to understand, through years of careful honesty and slowly opening the story he kept private for so long, is that Diana was not a saint or a symbol or fairy tale. She was a person, funny and complicated and deeply human, capable of great warmth and occasional stubbornness, brave in ways that most people would never fully appreciate. And their friendship was not a glamorous celebrity connection. It was two people who found each other in the middle of lives that were simultaneously too public and too lonely, who gave each other permission to be real. That is what made it matter. That is what made losing it unbearable. He carries her still, in his advocacy work, in his fierce protectiveness of her sons, in the way he speaks about kindness, as though it is the most radical and important thing a person can choose. Elton John has spent the years since Diana died trying to live up to what she showed him was possible. That one person willing to extend genuine compassion to those the world has discarded can change the way the world sees him entirely. She proved that. He watched her prove it, and he has never stopped trying to honor it. The silence is finally broken, not because the story has an ending that brings comfort, but because some stories are too important to keep hidden. Two outsiders who found each other in a castle ballroom and changed each other's lives forever. A friendship tested by the impossible pressures of fame and institution and pride. A reconciliation that came just in time to matter, and just too late to be enough. And a man still sitting at a piano, somewhere in the silence between the notes, hearing the laughter of someone the world was never quite ready to lose.